This, of course, came as a huge shock, and William and I have been doing everything we can to process and manage this privately for the sake of our young family.
The procession was already moving when Catherine saw it. For one frozen second, the noise, ceremony, and carefully rehearsed royal order seemed to disappear around her. Resting against Camilla's formal attire was a ruby pendant Catherine recognized instantly, an intensely personal piece connected to Diana. Then came the gesture nobody expected. Catherine stopped. Not later, not behind palace doors, but during the state procession itself, forcing everyone around her to confront what she had seen. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. William saw the change before anyone understood it. He watched Catherine's calm expression harden into disbelief, then moved closer as the line behind them began to hesitate. A state procession is a formal royal movement, arranged with strict timing, which is why a brief break in formation carries symbolic weight. The prince asked what was wrong. She did not answer for seconds. Instead, she looked directly at Camilla's chest, and he followed her gaze. Catherine knew what she was seeing. Diana's ruby pendant was not simply another jewel drawn from a palace collection. Within this dramatized account, it was treated as a personal keepsake tied to memory, family, and unresolved grief. She had encountered enough of Diana's preserved belongings to recognize the unusual setting. That knowledge turned surprise into resolve. Catherine stopped moving entirely. William stayed beside her, aware this was no accidental pause. Camilla noticed the stare. She appeared composed, but then her hand rose toward the ruby. That small instinctive movement mattered. Catherine read it as confirmation that the queen consort, the wife of the reigning king, knew what she was wearing. The monarch's wife did not remove the pendant, and she did not look away. William saw the gesture too, and his concern deepened as the ceremonial lines stalled around them. Charles finally turned. The king, meaning the reigning sovereign, had sensed the disruption behind him, but Catherine's quiet explanation changed the mood. When she identified the pendant, he did not tell her to continue. He ordered the procession paused. A ceremonial pause simply means the planned royal movement is temporarily stopped by command. But here, the order carried far more weight than protocol. Charles looked toward Camilla, then back to Catherine, understanding that the argument was no longer about timing. The silence now held years of history. Catherine remained motionless, William close beside her, while Camilla kept one hand near the ruby, and Charles faced the fracture opening in front of him. The procession could be paused with a command, but what the king could not stop was the personal history now rushing into that silence. To anyone outside the family, it was jewelry. To Catherine, it was memory, inheritance, and a boundary that had suddenly been crossed in public. But the deeper tension was not simply between two royal women. William stood at the center of it, looking at an object tied to the mother he lost and the woman his father married. And beside him was Catherine, realizing that silence might now feel more disloyal than confrontation. William moved closer once the procession stopped. The Prince of Wales, the title held by the heir to the throne, had learned to control his face in public, but grief pushed through. He asked Catherine quietly, "Are you certain?" She answered without hesitation. He studied the ruby, then tightened his jaw. For him, Diana was not history. She was his mother, and objects linked to her carried memories no court protocol could erase. Catherine understood that pain because it had shaped their marriage for years. She had treated Diana's legacy carefully, not as a royal story to display, but as part of William's private life and the emotional world their children had inherited. Camilla understood the sensitivity too. The queen consort, meaning the wife of a reigning king, had spent years building a place inside the monarchy, yet anything connected to Diana remained different. Rank could establish position. It could not erase memory. Camilla felt the accusation before anyone said it aloud. She saw Catherine's stare, watched William's expression harden and became defensive. To her, the halted procession now felt like a public challenge to her dignity. She kept her hand close to the pendant and looked toward Charles as if expecting him to restore order. But the king was no longer focused on ceremony. He was looking at the ruby. Charles stopped speaking mid-sentence. That silence struck William harder than an explanation could have, because his father clearly recognized the piece too. Catherine then leaned toward the prince and told him something she had not yet said publicly. The pendant had been stored separately from the general royal jewelry collection. In plain terms, it had not been sitting among pieces routinely selected for formal events. Someone had deliberately moved it. William's grief turned into anger. He looked at Catherine, then at Camilla, before facing his father. "We need an explanation now," he said quietly. Charles did not answer, and the queen consort did not lower her hand. The procession remained frozen, but the real confrontation had begun. William wanted to know how Camilla obtained the pendant before anyone took another step, and the answer would force them backward, to one private encounter days earlier that had already pushed Catherine to the edge. The ruby pendant had not appeared from nowhere. Days before the procession, Catherine had experienced a moment inside Windsor that suddenly looked far more important. She had walked into a private jewelry room expecting a routine discussion about ceremonial pieces, and found something that unsettled her. An open storage case, Camilla already inside, and Diana's inventory records being reviewed. At the time, Catherine chose restraint. After the procession stopped, that decision would haunt everyone in the room. Catherine had understood the rules around those objects for years. Historic jewelry could be managed differently depending on ceremonial use, ownership history, and personal association. And Diana's private pieces were treated with greater care because they carried family meaning beyond public display. She had already made one point clear to palace staff. Anything closely tied to William's mother should never be reassigned casually, without him knowing. That boundary was not about rank. It was about respect. 4 days before the procession, Catherine entered the Windsor jewelry room and found Camilla examining a tray while the ruby pendant case sat open nearby. The princess asked why it had been removed. The queen consort did not step away. Instead, she replied that the monarchy could not preserve every object as though time had stopped. Catherine absorbed the words without raising her voice, but her answer cut deeper. Some things, she said, were not hers, or anyone else's, to redefine. Camilla stiffened. She believed Catherine was questioning more than jewelry. To her, the objection touched her place inside the family itself. Catherine refused to soften the point. Diana's personal pieces, she said, could not simply become ceremonial accessories because circumstances had changed. Before either woman could go further, an aide entered, and the conversation stopped abruptly. The pendant was returned to its compartment, the case was closed, and the princess left believing the matter had been settled. Catherine later told William about that encounter in a private conversation. She explained that she had specifically requested the ruby not be used during the coming procession. The prince listened in silence, then understood why seeing it on Camilla had felt so deliberate. What had looked like a sudden public reaction was actually the end of a warning that had already been given. William now saw the crisis differently. Catherine had restrained herself once, trusted the promise implied by that closed case, and walked away. But the pendant had returned in the most public setting possible. Now that warning had been broken before the entire procession. Restraint was gone, and Catherine and Camilla were finally about to face each other without ceremony to protect them. The doors closed, and the ceremonial smiles vanished with them. Catherine did not shout. That made the confrontation more severe. She looked at Camilla, then at the ruby pendant still resting around her neck, and asked one devastatingly simple question. Why did you wear it after I asked you not to? William remained beside his wife. Charles stood several feet away, and for the first time that day, Nobody had protocol left to hide behind. Charles had ordered the four of them into a private receiving room, while officials outside tried to stabilize the delayed procession. A receiving room is a formal palace space used for private meetings before or after public duties. But there was nothing routine about this one. Catherine stayed focused. She did not attack Camilla's title or place in the family. She returned to the same point again and again: the open case at Windsor, the warning she had given, and the boundary she believed had been ignored. Catherine looked directly at Camilla. She reminded her that she had seen Diana's pendant removed days earlier, and had clearly asked that it not be used. The Queen Consort pushed back, saying she believed royal history belonged to the crown and should not remain permanently locked away. The crown, in this context, meant the monarchy as an institution, rather than one individual person. William heard the words and went still. William finally stepped into the argument. The prince said quietly that Diana's memory was not an abstract chapter of royal history to him. She was his mother. Ceremony could not change that, and institutional language could not make the pain less personal. Camilla looked toward him, but he did not retreat. Catherine remained beside him, and the anger in the room shifted into something heavier, grief that had waited years for someone to name it plainly. Camilla turned toward Charles as though expecting support. Instead, the king asked one question: who had authorized access to the pendant? She hesitated. That hesitation changed everything. Catherine noticed it immediately, and William did too. The dispute was no longer only about whether wearing the piece had been insensitive. It was now about whether someone had bypassed the normal chain of authority. Camilla reached toward the clasp, but Catherine stopped her. "Wait," she said, insisting the pendant remain exactly where it was, until the release records were checked. Charles agreed. He ordered the jewelry access log brought in immediately. What began as Catherine defending a memory was becoming something colder. Someone inside the palace had said yes, and now the king wanted to know who. Charles expected a simple answer. Instead, the record placed him in an even more uncomfortable position. The pendant had not been taken without paperwork. Someone had approved its release. That meant the crisis could no longer be dismissed as a misunderstanding between Catherine and Camilla. A decision had been made somewhere inside the machinery of the palace, and when the authorization sheet was placed before the king, the room became silent for an entirely different reason. Charles took the ceremonial release record from a senior household officer and read it without speaking. A release record is the internal document used to track when a protected royal object is removed, by whom, and under whose authority. Catherine watched him closely. William stood beside her. Camilla remained opposite them, still wearing the ruby, while the king read the page a second time. The problem was larger than anyone wanted to admit. Sensitive historic pieces were not supposed to move casually between storage and public use, especially when ownership and personal association were disputed. Whoever authorized this release had effectively pushed past Catherine's earlier warning, and done so without consulting William. Charles placed the paper on the table and asked why he had not been informed. Camilla sat down for the first time. The Queen Consort had expected the argument to remain personal, perhaps even emotional, but the monarch was now examining the process itself. He was no longer asking whether Catherine had overreacted. He wanted to know whether palace procedures had been used to sidestep his authority. Charles looked at the authorization line again. The request had been processed through personnel attached to Camilla's household, meaning staff working directly under her side of the royal operation had initiated the release. He removed his glasses, placed them beside the page, and asked quietly, "Why did your office request this?" She hesitated before saying she believed the piece was suitable for ceremonial use. William did not accept that answer, and Catherine's expression hardened. The king made his decision immediately. He ordered every Diana-associated personal jewel temporarily removed from ceremonial circulation. until ownership, permissions, and access procedures could be reviewed. In simple terms, nobody would wear another disputed piece until the palace established who truly had the right to approve it. Camilla looked toward Charles, but he had already turned to the next question. Officials outside needed to know whether the procession would resume, and whether she could return wearing the pendant. The paperwork had answered how the ruby reached Camilla. Now Charles had to decide what the monarchy would do with her once everyone knew. The most powerful moment came without an argument. Camilla stood before a mirror, reached behind her neck, and released the clasp. Seconds later, Diana's ruby pendant lay in her palm. Nobody celebrated. Catherine looked away. William remained rigid. Charles watched the jewel being returned to its case, and understood that whatever happened next, the ceremony outside could never resume, as though the interruption had been meaningless. Charles gave the instruction quietly. The pendant would not return to the procession, and it had to be secured before anyone left the room. A ceremonial schedule is the tightly planned order governing where senior royals stand, move, and appear during a state event, and officials outside were already rewriting it. Positions were shifted. The route was shortened. Every adjustment was designed to preserve dignity, while hiding how deeply the family had been shaken. Camilla held the ruby for several seconds before lowering it into the open case. Catherine remained nearby, saying nothing, as the queen consort closed the lid herself. Her hands trembled slightly, but nobody commented. The silence carried enough humiliation already. Charles watched without intervening, while William stayed rigid beside his wife, still processing how quickly a family wound had become an institutional crisis. Catherine refused to treat the moment as victory. She turned toward William and admitted she wished the confrontation had never been necessary. The princess had protected a boundary, but she understood the cost. His grief had been dragged into public ceremony. His father had been forced against his wife, and Camilla had been made to remove the jewel under scrutiny. William heard the sadness beneath her resolve, and his anger softened without disappearing. William then faced Charles with one request. He wanted Diana's most personal jewelry protected permanently from future release, unless close family members gave direct authorization. The prince was no longer talking about one pendant. He was asking for a rule that would prevent memory from becoming convenience again. The king listened carefully, and agreed in principle that the existing arrangement would be rewritten. Charles knew what that admission meant. The halted procession had changed more than the schedule. It had exposed a weakness in royal practice, and forced the monarch to acknowledge it openly within the family. Camilla remained silent, while Catherine understood that the boundary she defended would now outlast the confrontation itself. William still had one question. Before returning outside, he asked Catherine to speak with him alone. The public crisis had forced action, but away from Charles and Camilla, he needed to know whether she had stopped the procession for Diana, or also for him. For the first time since the procession stopped, there were no aides, no officials, no Camilla, and no king. Only William and Catherine. He closed the door, stood in silence for several seconds, and then admitted something he had never expected to say that morning. Seeing Diana's pendant had hurt him, but watching Catherine stop the procession had affected him differently. She had defended a boundary he had spent years learning not to confront publicly. William had carried that tension for most of his life. As Prince of Wales, the title traditionally held by the monarch's heir, he was expected to place duty above personal emotion, even when the two collided. Diana's memory followed him through every stage of royal life, yet ceremony had trained him to remain composed. Catherine understood that burden. She also understood that stopping a state procession, a formal public royal movement governed by strict protocol, could invite criticism because any interruption could be read as deliberate defiance. William took Catherine's hand and finally admitted what had happened inside him. His first instinct had been to keep moving. Years of training had taught the prince not to disrupt a public event, no matter how painful the moment became. Seeing the ruby around Camilla's neck had made him feel suddenly young again, caught between grief and expectation. Catherine listened without interrupting, and his anger slowly gave way to something more vulnerable. Catherine told him she had not stopped to humiliate Camilla. She had stopped because once she recognized the pendant, continuing forward would have felt like pretending his mother's personal history no longer mattered. The princess knew there would be consequences, but silence would have carried its own message. To her, walking on would have looked like acceptance, and she could not allow that when William was standing beside her. William looked at her for a long moment. Then he said quietly, "You did what I couldn't do in that second." The words changed everything. Catherine's action was no longer simply a confrontation. To him, it had become protection. Together, William and Catherine agreed that Diana's most private belongings needed clear boundaries before he inherited greater responsibility within the monarchy. They wanted rules strong enough to prevent emotion from being overruled by convenience again. When they returned to the corridor side by side, Charles saw the difference immediately. The crisis had not divided them, it had strengthened them. Catherine had made peace with William. But beyond those doors, Britain was already turning a stopped procession into something far larger than a family dispute. By the time the procession resumed, the defining image of the day was no longer the ceremony itself. It was the interruption. Catherine standing still, William turning toward her, Camilla's hand rising instinctively toward the ruby at her throat. That single moment escaped the palace's control almost instantly. Within hours, the country was no longer debating protocol. It was debating memory, loyalty, Diana, and whether one piece of jewelry had exposed a fault line the monarchy had never truly resolved. Charles approved a brief official statement that confirmed only a ceremonial delay and an adjusted program. A palace statement is the monarchy's formal public response to an event, usually written to control facts without revealing private family discussions. The wording avoided the pendant entirely, but the omission created its own suspicion. When Camilla returned without the ruby, commentators immediately connected the missing jewel to Catherine's sudden stop, and speculation spread faster than the household could contain it. Camilla watched the coverage alone. The queen consort stared as the same few seconds replayed again. Catherine stopping, William leaning toward her, and her own hand moving toward the necklace. She switched the television off before the commentary finished. What had felt like a private dispute was now being judged by millions, and she could no longer control which meaning the public attached to her decision. Catherine feared something different. She told William privately that people might see cruelty where she had intended protection. The princess worried the moment would be reduced to rivalry between two women instead of the boundary she believed had been broken. William reassured her that one image would not decide everything. What mattered, the prince said, was what the family did next. Outside Buckingham Palace, the argument became something larger. Evening crowds gathered near the gates as broadcasts replayed the interruption, and one placard reading, "Diana Still Matters," began appearing repeatedly in television coverage. A major evening front page pushed the symbolism even further, running Catherine's frozen moment beneath the headline, "The Moment the Royal Line Stopped." Charles saw the coverage too. The king understood that the palace could shorten a procession, issue a statement, and remove a pendant, but it could not erase what the interruption had come to represent. So he summoned William, Catherine, and Camilla once more. This time, there would be no argument about what happened. Britain had already reached its emotional conclusion. Now Charles had to decide what would happen to Diana's ruby pendant permanently, and whether the confrontation would end in bitterness or meaning. The final decision was made without cameras, procession music, or ceremony. Diana's ruby pendant sat inside its case, on the table between Charles, William, Catherine, and Camilla. Hours earlier, it had divided them. Now it demanded an answer. Charles looked first at his son, then at Catherine, before delivering the ruling that closed the crisis. The pendant would no longer be available for general ceremonial use. It would remain protected as part of Diana's personal family legacy. Charles made the boundary unmistakable. The king confirmed that Diana's most personal jewelry would now be separated from pieces available for ordinary ceremonial rotation. In simple terms, those keepsakes would no longer be treated like accessories chosen for public events. William would also have direct involvement in decisions concerning his mother's private belongings, recognizing that emotional inheritance mattered alongside palace administration. The prince listened without interrupting, understanding how much had changed since the procession stopped. Camilla looked at the closed case and did not argue. She admitted that wearing the ruby during the procession had misjudged how deeply the object remained tied to Diana and to William's grief. The queen consort did not defend the decision again. Catherine answered just as quietly. She told her that she had never wanted humiliation or exclusion. She had objected because one boundary had been discussed beforehand, and then crossed anyway. Charles turned toward Catherine next. He told the princess that stopping the procession had been disruptive, but he also acknowledged that the disruption exposed a problem the family had failed to settle in private. She accepted the words without triumph. William then placed his hand over the jewelry case for a second, before closing it himself and returning it for protected storage. The future king understood that securing the pendant was not about burying Diana's memory. It was about deciding who had the right to protect it. Catherine felt relief more than victory. Beside her, William finally seemed lighter, because his mother's memory had been defended without being turned into a weapon. Charles gave a small nod. Camilla remained quiet, accepting the boundary that now stood between personal legacy and ceremonial use. The procession had begun as a display of royal continuity, but it ended by exposing something more human. Catherine stopped, because one ruby pendant represented a line she believed should never have been crossed. Charles ultimately agreed. William gained a clearer voice over Diana's private legacy, and the monarchy learned a lesson. Preserving history does not mean stripping it of the people who gave it meaning. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.